Be fruitful and multiply. This is a vital theme that runs from the very beginning of the Bible to the very end. If you want to do a good word study, an interesting word study, just follow the theme of fruitfulness. Pick it up at the beginning and just follow it through the scriptures, and you'll see that it is significant. Now, when we look at Genesis 1, 27 and 28, when we consider that passage, our natural tendency is to think in light of physical reproduction, of having lots of kids. And that is certainly one aspect of it, or one application. But this passage also has spiritual ramifications. When God said, or when God blessed them, commanded them, was kind of a combination of the two. When he said, be fruitful and multiply, yeah, he meant fill the earth with children, but he also meant be fruitful spiritually and multiply that. As a matter of fact, one of the primary reasons that God rejected the nation of Israel is that they were unfruitful. And we find that in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. We're not going to go there right now. But if you look at that passage, it says that God planted Israel as a fruitful or a choice vine with the idea that it would bear fruit. And it didn't. That vine did not bear fruit. It did not bear the fruit that he expected. And so that nation was rejected from being the people of God. Now, one of the things that we need to understand is that there is a distinct difference between being fruitful and being successful. In the eyes of our world, or in our natural minds, or natural eyes, success matters. Success means everything. And one of the reasons is that success is something that we can quantitatively measure. How big, how many, how much, those are numbers that we can identify. But with fruitfulness, you can't do that. You can't quantitatively measure, at least not from a human perspective, the full extent of a fruitful life. For example, we can measure how many people attend a church service, and that's the thing that we track because it's quantifiable. So we say, well, how many people are in your church? Well, this many people attended this given week. And we can compare that to other churches. But when we talk about the influence that a church has, that's beyond our human ability to measure. And so fruitfulness is something that really can only be measured by God. And I would even go as far as saying that fruitfulness is God's definition of success. Now, I define fruitfulness as being conformed into the image of Christ and multiplying the influence of that character in the lives of others. Let me say that again. Fruitfulness is being conformed into the image of Christ and multiplying the influence of that character in the lives of other people. In essence, this is the Great Commission that we find in Matthew 28, 19 and 20, when Jesus said, go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to do all that I have commanded you to do. So what he's saying is, as I have invested in you and I have grown you to be conformed into my image, I want you to go and invest in others and teach them how to do what I taught you how to do, so that they can abide in my grace and they can also be transformed. They can also be a fruitful people. Now, when it comes to fruitfulness, everyone can have the same quality of fruit, but not everyone will have the same measure of multiplication. You see, quality of fruit is a result of our abiding relationship with Jesus Christ. As we walk with God on a day in and day out basis and we abide in his life-giving grace, any one of us can be transformed into his image to grow in his quality, to grow in his character. That potential is there for everybody to the same capacity, because we all have the same capacity for a relationship with God. But when it comes to the multiplication of our fruit, there are other factors incorporated, such as our social connections, our geographic location, our personal abilities, even technology. Those factors can influence the multiplication of the fruit in our lives. And so it's important to realize that everybody is different. Everybody has a different calling. Everybody has a different sphere of influence. And we need to learn to be content with the sphere that God has given us. Now, poor quality of fruit reveals the lack of an ongoing connection with God. And I'm not talking about an individual action or even a period of time, but about a consistent characterization. Anybody can have a bad day, a bad week, a bad year, a bad season. But when somebody professes Christ and their life is consistently unfruitful, that's a time when you have to pause and you have to ask some questions. Because failing to bear good fruit is really a bad deal. Let me share a few scriptures for you that I think are worded very strongly. And again, we don't want to fall under condemnation, but we do want to realize the seriousness of this issue. Matthew 3:10 records John the Baptist coming on the scene and proclaiming that the axe is already laid at the root of the trees. Therefore, every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Jesus offended the chief priests and the elders when he said, "Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it." That's Matthew 21:43. The kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a kingdom producing the fruit of it. Those are really heavy words, especially in light of the fact that they were spoken to religious leaders. These were people who had spent their entire lives learning about the things of God, professing allegiance and devotion to God. And yet Jesus is saying, your lives are not bearing the fruit that they should bear. And as a result, I am going to take what should be your inheritance, and I'm going to give it to somebody who does walk with me and produces that fruit. The iconic classic chapter of John's Gospel, chapter 15, records some really powerful statements that Jesus made about this issue, this subject. John 15:1 and 2, Jesus says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit he prunes it so that it may bear more fruit." Now these are difficult words to process, and I understand there's some disagreement regarding interpretation of this passage, but the overall context has to deal with the issue of pruning. And pruning involves two primary dimensions. The first is that you cut off the dead wood. You cut off the wood that is no longer alive. It can become diseased. It can become a major hindrance to the plant. And so that thing is cut off. The second aspect of pruning is that you cut off current growth for the sake of future fruitfulness. And that aspect is a little bit harder to understand because there are situations, and this is actually pretty normal for those that I grow blueberry bushes, and so I understand this, but anybody that grows things understands that you cut off very good, healthy, potentially fruit-bearing branches or vines in order to produce a greater harvest somewhere down the road. And so that means that this whole thing of fruit-bearing is a process. Another thing that's important to understand is that pruning is both individual and corporate. What do I mean? Well, first, it applies to our individual lives. There may be aspects of our lives that are dead weight or dead wood and that God pulls out, perhaps relationships, perhaps activities, but there might also be potentially fruit-bearing aspects of our lives that God cuts back or limits because he's looking for greater fruitfulness down the road. Now, that same principle also applies to what we might call religious growth. And what I'm talking about is a larger religious context. You see, these statements that Jesus made and John the Baptist made about fruitfulness and about pruning, they were made toward a society that was highly religious, steeped in religion, and yet many of them totally missed the point of everything. They totally missed that it was about a relationship with God and not about their performance. Bearing spiritual fruit is a relational process. It is a highly relational process. As a matter of fact, fruit can be described as excess life that comes from abiding. If you think about a fruit tree, that tree has so much life and so much vitality that not only is it able to grow, but it is able to produce something sweet and delicious and reproductive on top of its own livelihood. It has excess life. And the same idea applies to our relationship with God. When we walk with God and we abide in his life-giving grace, it changes us. There's something that happens from the inside out that transforms who we are. And I'm not talking about self-improvement. I'm not talking about some sort of a forced character change. I'm talking about a byproduct of walking with Him. As we learn how to align our lives with God's design and we learn how to abide in His life-giving grace, there is a transformation that happens in our own lives as a result of that excess life. Now, I said this already, but this is really important that we would get. Spiritual fruit is not the basis of our acceptance with God, but it is an indicator of our relationship with God. Spiritual fruit is not the basis of our acceptance with God, but it is an indicator of our relationship with God. And so when Jesus said to the Pharisees that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a nation bearing the fruit of, what he was saying is that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a nation of people who walk with me, who know me, who abide in my grace. That essentially is what he was saying. So it's important that we understand this, that it is an indicator of a relationship with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords.